quadratic formula. Quadratic formula is very simple to use. It's tedious, but it's very simple to use. We start off by looking at every quadratic equation. We need to be in this form. The form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now that could be equal to f of x. It could be equal to y as well. But for the purpose of solving, we're going to always think about it as being equal to 0, because when we set it equal to 0, we're finding the solutions or the x-intercepts. What this does, quadratic formula finds those 2 points. But in order for this to work, 2 things that have to occur. We must have an x squared. That's how we know it's quadratic. We must have it equal to 0. Okay. So now we'll take a look at what we're going to be doing today. The quadratic formula, which you can see here, is just another way. We've learned graphing, and graphing is great, but you have to have specific answers. It doesn't really help when they get kind of detailed. We've looked at factoring, and a table goes with the graphing, but factoring is great only if it's factorable. We've also learned how to complete the square, which works pretty well, but it's a lot of work. So today we go to the easiest way, which is simply the quadratic formula. It is easy. There's no problem with it, other than the fact that it is kind of tedious. So as you see it, recognize that it works great, but it is a kind of a pain to do. So let's go ahead and look at it in detail here. We have the formula itself says that x equals, which x being the solution, equals negative b, or the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. So let's look at the formula. We have opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. Now, a couple things you should see that are familiar there is this. In case you don't remember, it's been a while. The negative b divided by 2a is the axis of symmetry. So if you remember, you have a parabola, and there's always a line that goes right to the middle of it. And that negative b divided by 2a is that middle line. The rest of it gives you this distance from the middle to the edge. That's why then you also see the plus minus. Plus minus means you do both adding and subtracting. So really, this is 2 different formulas. This is negative b plus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. And it's also negative b minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. So you really have 2 different equations there that you have to follow. That's why it becomes tedious. You just got to do 2 things. So next, let's look real closely at this part right here, b squared minus 4ac, which is called the discriminant. It basically separates the 3 different types of answers you can get. If you look at that piece, that's the part that's under the square root sign. If you get a positive, which is what this means, if you get a positive, that means you're adding or subtracting a certain amount to the axis of symmetry. So if you get a positive, what that means is you have 2 solutions. And that means you have one that looks kind of like this or like this. So it crosses at 2 different places. Okay? If you have b squared minus 4ac equals 0, that means what you're adding to the axis of symmetry is 0 each time. So if you add 0 or subtract 0, you get the same thing, which means there's only one solution. That means you have something that looks like this, where there's only one solution there. It could be upside down like that. And then finally, and this is why you use the discriminant to find this. B squared minus 4ac is less than 0. That means it's a negative number. Okay, well, if you take the square root of a negative number, you're going to get error. You can't do it. What that means is there are no solutions, because you can't add or subtract anything. There's nothing to add or subtract. And in fact, if you try to add or subtract anything, you get a bloop. You can't do it. So that means there's no solutions. And that's where you see one like this or like this, where you can't factor it. You try to graph it, and it looks like this. So there's no solutions, meaning nothing where it crosses the x-axis. You factor, it's not factorable, but you can still graph it. You try completing the square, you get nothing, or you get negative inside the square root sign. And here you see a better version of it, a little bit bigger version of it. I'm just going to go over it real quickly. If you have ax squared plus bx plus C. That's where all of these letters come from, is A, B, and C. Notice no X's. Okay, we're not going to use this. We're not going to use this. We only use the coefficients of A, B, and C. We don't use anything else. Okay, and this negative B means the opposite of B. Okay, so be careful of that. It means the opposite of B. Then plus minus means we're going to add and subtract. And I'll show you how to work through that. We're not going to do two different problems. We're going to do one to the very end. And then b squared minus 4ac. And keep in mind that is a negative 4. So when you multiply it, that could have an effect. All right. Then for our first example, we'll do x squared minus 2x minus 24 equals 0. So the first thing we should always do is go through and determine a, b, and c. A in this case is 1. B is negative 2. C is negative 24. We'll get to the discriminant and the number of solutions here in a minute, but we're going to go ahead and set it all up and plug in and get to work. So let's go through it. We'll start with the opposite of B, so negative of negative 2 plus or minus the square root of B squared, so negative 2 squared. And notice I'm going to put in the parentheses because later on when you try to do this in the calculator, you need to put in parentheses. But minus 4 times A, which is 1, times C, which is negative 24, divided by 2 times A, which is 1. So notice I kept it plus minus. We're going to work through this. Just slowly work through it. The opposite of negative 2 is 2. So we have 2 plus or minus the square root of 4, because negative 2 squared is 4. And then I'll look at negative 4 times 1 times negative 24. That's going to give me a positive 96 divided by 2. Now, notice that if we go back to the discriminant, that's this number here. So the discriminant is actually 100, 4 plus 96. That is a positive. And a positive means 2 solutions. So keep that in mind as we finish this up. There's going to be 2 solutions. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this as 2 plus or minus the square root of 100 divided by 2, which we all know is 2 plus or minus 10 divided by 2. Okay, so now we're going to split it up. 2 plus 10 divided by 2, 2 minus 10 divided by 2. And I know some of y'all are looking at this going, I know the answer already. That's fine. I'm showing you this because this is a really simple one. In fact, you would probably factor this, but it's a really simple one. But I want you to see how you go through the motions here. And now 2 plus 10 is 12. So basically it's 12 divided by 2. So this equals 6. One of your solutions is 6. 2 minus 10 is negative 8. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. So we have 2 solutions, x equals 6 and x equals negative 4. That means if you were to graph this, you would find that it crosses the x-axis at 6 and negative 4. Now we'll look at our second example, 12x squared minus 7x equals 3. So again, now this isn't set up quite right. We have to write this where it's equal to 0. So we get our a, b, and c. So this is going to be 12x squared minus 7x minus 3 equals 0. Now we know that a is 12, b is negative 7, c is negative 3. So let's go ahead and plug in. We're going to have the opposite of negative 7, opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 7 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 12, times c, which is negative 3, divided by 2 times a, which is 24. So let's clean all that up. That's going to be 7 plus or minus the square root of 49, and then negative 4, negative 3, and 12 is 144. So plus 144 divided by 48. Now we'll clean this up. I'm right over here. So it's going to be 7 plus or minus the square root of 193 divided by 48. Now, this is part of the reason I had you memorize all those perfect squares. So you see 193 and you recognize that's not a perfect square. You can't take the square root of it. The example before was 100. You should recognize that it was 10. Here you can't. So now from this point, we go ahead and split it. We'll have 7 plus the square root of 193 divided by 48. And we'll have 7 minus the square root of 193 divided by 48. And at this point, you have no choice but to put in the calculator, or you do have a choice, but for right now, we're just going to put in the calculator. And at this point, we'll put on our calculator. 7 plus the square root of 193 is 20.892, and we'll divide that by 48. And when we do that, we get 0.435. So one of the solutions is x equals 0.435. Next, we'll go to the right side, and we'll do 7 minus the square root of 193, which will give us negative 6.892. We'll divide that by 48, and that will give us negative 0.1435, which we're going to round to 0.144. So you notice that if we tried to factor that, we probably wouldn't get anything because those aren't obvious answers there. But we can solve it by the calculator, by the formula, and get the exact answer. So that's what we're trying to do here. Finally, when you do put this in the calculator, be very careful, okay? You're not going to put it in like this. This would be silly. It's too much work, plus you have that. You want to work this down by hand until you get to 7 plus the square root of 193 divided by 24 and 7 minus the square root of 193 divided by 24. And even then, when you do that in the calculator, you want to put this in the calculator and hit equals, and then divided by 24, okay? Then do this in the calculator, and then equals, and then divided by 24. You don't want to put it all in one time because you will get different answers. The order of operations does really have an effect on this. So work it down by hand. You've got to work it down by hand, and then plug it into the calculator.